So before we talk about mixing, we should probably talk about processors and effects. The main difference between processors and effects are that processors are something that's going to take care of the entire signal, and effects will more or less affect only parts of the signal. So the most common processor are dynamics processors, which are compressors or limiters. And essentially what they do is they change the dynamic levels. A compressor compresses the level and then making it so that the dynamic range is smaller and usually makes things a little bit louder. A limiter kind of does the opposite. It actually takes lower sounds and makes them louder. And it also is used to really maximize the volume in a track. The other common processor is the equalizer, and an equalizer is something that will shape the sound a little bit. It allows you to have control over bands of frequencies rather than turning the volume up or down on an entire track. You can actually pick and kind of go in and surgically change the sound of it. And then the third processor are distortions. These are usually used on guitars, but they're often used on other things too. Now, the main thing that you won't see here is a wet-dry mix. You'll note, with the one exception of possibly the dynamics processor, but in general, these are going to be processing the entire signal. Now, with effects, we're really just dealing with two basic ideas. One is going to be some sort of a delay, or echo, or reverbs, and all of those are basically time-based effects. And then the others are modulation effects. Pitch shifters, choruses, phase shifters, and things like that. And all of these will add unusual sounds to your mix, or not so unusual, but they'll all change the sound in a way that is not just simply designed to make it fit together better. Now, what's important to understand is where to place these. When you're dealing with processors, they pretty much have to be inserts, and that means that they're going to go on an individual track. And we'll look at that in live in just a second here, and in Reason. And so when we create a combinator, for example, in Reason, and we put a processor in that combinator, that's an insert, that's an inline effect. And then the same with live, when we just drag an effect to a track channel, that's an inserted effect. It'll process the entire signal, but it'll only process it on that one track. And if you're using an effect, you want to set the wet-dry mix, because that's how you control the volume of the effect. Now, on an auxiliary track, we're splitting the signal, and we'll send part of the signal from the main track to the auxiliary track. The auxiliary track will process only the amount of signal that is sent to it, and then the dry signal will still remain on the main track. The other thing is that you can combine tracks, so you can send signals from multiple tracks to one auxiliary track, and it will mix it there. You will set your processors to 100% wet there, because you can use the slider, the fader control, to determine how much of the effect is actually going to be put into the mix. And you really only use this for effects. I mean, there are times when you might want to put a processor in here, but for the most part, you're only going to be doing effects. Okay, so let's take a look at Reason's devices. Now you can see it's got a pretty large collection of devices here. For example, and some of them are distortion units like the pulverizer or the scream, and then there are others that are time-based like the echo and the reverb. Other processors, we have equalizers, compressors, maximizers, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of different ones. They're all in this project, they've all been placed in line. So, for example, here's my NNXT. I have a reverb, I have a scream, The arpeggiator is a MIDI effect, so we don't really call that a processor at all. And so both of these are in line. And so I have to, when I'm looking at the Rev 7 in particular, you see I had to set the wet-dry mix, and I set it pretty low because I didn't want too much of that in there. Okay. On the other hand, this is actually a processor, and it's also in line, and then I don't have a wet-dry mix to set here, so I basically, all I have is a volume control. And I used a variety of different effects here. Let's see, I used a number of reverbs. Now, this is probably not very processor efficient, but our computers are so powerful these days that it doesn't really matter, and so you can really kind of play around with this a lot. And then sometimes I use the older half rack effects, and those can be pretty useful too. This is a digital delay. Okay, so I use a variety of different effects just to get the sounds that I'm looking for, and that's what we did. Now over here, when you're putting effects in line, they're going to go down in this section here, and the easiest way to do it is you just simply click on one and drag it onto the track, and then you've placed it in line. And once again, then it's going to be when you're on a track, you'll have to set your wet-dry mix. And so you can see that I have wet-dry mixes set on all of these here. Okay. On the other hand, we also have sends. Okay. Let's go over actually to the session view. Now, one of the interesting things about live is that the mixer, while these are not entirely related to what's going on in the arrangement, these controls are. And so if we change the volume here, we're going to change the volume that's being played in the other side. And I like working in this view for mixing much better than I do in the other view, partly because it looks more like a mixer. Okay, so let's take, so when these are in line now, we have all of these, we have our wet-dry mix. But when we want to send signals to the sends, to the auxiliary channels, we have 3 sends here, and you can see we have 3 auxiliary channels. And the amount of signal that comes from here and goes to here is determined by how much we send here. Now, the entire signal is still going to this. So we have a completely dry signal, and then part of the signal is also being sent here. And then the volume of the reverb, or the signals that have been sent to the reverb and processed there, the volume that's going to be added into the master is right here. And so we control that here. Okay. Generally, I leave this at unity gain or pretty close, and use the sends to control just how much of the signal I'm going to send in there. But you can just, if you know, sometimes I will decide that I want to pull this down and it's just a little bit too much reverb. So for example, we should probably send most of our, we should send some reverb or some of the signal of most of these sounds to the reverb. And so I'm going to push those up a little bit. Certainly, the ones that I sometimes don't want to do that to is if I've already put a lot of reverb on them, if it's inline, if I've already got some inline reverb. And I'm also very careful about doing it with drums, because drums are going to, we want the drums to be very tight. So you might send the snare, you know, send some reverb to the, or send the snare signal to the reverb. But generally I don't do the kick drum, maybe a little bit on the hi-hats, okay, and the clap would probably be okay too. I'm not using a crash cymbal in this, so our cymbals are all in our reverses here. Same thing with the bass. I probably am not going to do that. Okay. Now, if you look at the bass, I've also used what's called a glue compressor, and this is a great compressor that's been added into Live just recently, and it does just what it says. It glues things together. And so I put a glue compressor on my bass, and I've also put a separate one on the drums. It looks like I have 2 of them there. I don't want 2, I just want 1. And then if you click on this, it will give you some presets available, and you can just kind of click on them and try them out. And it gives you some suggestions of what you might want to be working with. Okay, so that's basically how effects work. The ones that I've used here, for the most part, we can just kind of look through it real quickly. There's not a lot here, though I do have a compressor and the sidechain compressor. We've talked about that before. So basically, we're using, when I'm doing the sidechain is all coming from this sidechain kick, which is just simply 4 quarter notes that we never hear. Okay? It only is being used to go in and affect the compressors where I want it to pump. Okay? And so there's some effects there. You can see I've used some EQ3s, and those have been automated most of the time. And so you'll see that those are on a number of instruments. Okay. And then this is a delay, a multi-delay that I've used specifically on this one. And then I also have delays, signal of the chords being sent to our delay send there too.